So again, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. This event is called Ask GFI about alternative protein careers. So this is an open Zoom call that we host every 4 months to give you all an opportunity to ask questions about the emerging field of alternative proteins. So my name is Christina Aguila, and I work as the University Innovation Specialist here at the Good Food Institute. A bit about my background is that my formal education is in chemical engineering, and before joining GFI, I worked as a process engineer in the biopharmaceutical sector for a few years. But currently at the Good Food Institute, my work is focused on building a robust workforce that can support a global transition toward alternative proteins. So I'm doing this by supporting education and training programs and trying to illuminate the pathways into this growing field. So historically at these calls, we've had a mix of attendees that are looking for technical as well as non-technical roles. And there's also been a mix of students and people looking for entry-level positions, as well as professionals with years or even decades of experience in adjacent fields. So as I go through this, this presentation, I'll try to keep all of these different groups in mind, but please feel free to ask questions about your specific situation in the chat or in the Q&A. And in the second half of this webinar, I'll try to respond to as many of those questions as possible. And if we run out of time, then I'm going to type up the questions in a PDF and get that all to you over email. And then last thing I want to mention is just a few housekeeping notes. We are recording this meeting. Let me just make sure. Yes, we are recording this meeting and it's in webinar mode, which means the recording will just be my camera and slides. And we'll post this recording to YouTube, and by the end of tomorrow, I'll email all the registered attendees. So all of you, I'll email the video link, the link to these slides, and some more resources. So if you see any links in these slides, like don't worry about copying them down, because the slide deck will hit your inbox in the next, either today or tomorrow. So for this call, I'll start with a presentation that gives an overview of GFI and the alternative protein landscape. I'll talk about career fields and relevant backgrounds, and then give some tips and resources for building your career in the emerging alternative protein field. And in this section, I'll try to go over the most commonly asked questions. And then again, the second half will be a Q&A. So let's dive in. If you don't already know about the Good Food Institute, basically we are an international nonprofit working to build a sustainable, healthy, and just global food system. So we're doing this with unique insight across the scientific, policy, industry, and investment landscapes. So we're using the power of food innovation and markets to accelerate the transition toward alternative proteins. And to do this work, we focus on 3 key areas. So I'm in our science and technology department, where we're working to advance and open source the foundational science of alternative proteins. And then we also have a corporate engagement team that builds relationships with the world's largest food manufacturers and restaurants and retailers, even conventional meat companies. And they help them capitalize on opportunities in this space. And then lastly, our policy team advocates for the fair regulation of plant-based and cultivated meat, and also lobbies for government investment in research. And what motivates our work is the fact that our current system for producing meat, dairy, and eggs is extremely unsustainable and inefficient. We know that the system exacerbates climate change, environmental degradation, and antibiotic resistance. And it also impacts global food security and animal welfare. And despite more and more people learning about these problems, we're not quite seeing enough people changing the way that they eat. Instead, per capita meat consumption actually continues to rise globally. So our theory of change at GFI is based on the idea that consumers will choose alternative proteins when they are as delicious, affordable, and accessible as animal products. So instead of just asking consumers to give up the foods they love, we can instead make products that are just as tasty and affordable as conventional meats. And there are a few different ways we can produce these alternative proteins. We can use plants or fermentation, or we can cultivate it from animal cells. So I'll give a quick overview of each of these production platforms, starting with plant-based products. And to clarify, I'm not talking about tofu or those bright green veggie patties that don't look anything like conventional burgers. The products I am talking about are these next generation products that actually look, taste, and cook like conventional meats while offering complex carbs and fiber. So an example is the Beyond Meat patty that's pictured here. For plant-based, Impossible Meats and Beyond Meat are two of the big names in the sector, but there are plenty of other brands out there. If you see an alternative meat product at your local grocery store, chances are it's a plant-based product. The next production platform I'll talk about is cultivated meat. And you might have heard this referred to as cultured or cell-based meat, maybe even clean meat. That's all referring to alternative proteins that are produced from animal cells. So how does this work? In short, you start with a small sample of animal cells, and then you place it into a big tank, a bioreactor. And this provides the same conditions that you would find inside an animal, such as warmth, water, and basic nutrients. So from there, you can differentiate these cells into other types of cells and arrange them into a similar structure as animal tissues. And as a result, you can achieve a product that is genuine animal meat with the same sensory and nutritional profiles. There are dozens of cultivated meat companies around the world, but they haven't yet reached commercial scale production. And this is for a couple different reasons. Part of the challenge is scaling up these processes and bringing down the expensive costs. And then on the policy side, many countries are still formalizing their regulatory requirements to approve cultivated meat for sale, since this is considered a novel food product. So as a result, cultivated meat isn't sold in stores yet, unless you're in Singapore, whose government was the first to approve these products for sale. And then lastly, we have fermentation, which is an enabling technology that allows for the production of standalone protein sources or functional ingredients. So what does this mean? Essentially, we can program microorganisms into little factories that produce proteins or fats. And from there, we can either isolate these proteins from the microbes to use as ingredients, or we can harvest the entire protein biomass. And as a result, we can use these fermentation-derived ingredients to help take plant-based and cultivated products to the next level. It's important to note that in the near future, we probably won't see these three production platforms as distinct industry segments, but instead we'll probably see this large industry where we produce alternative protein products more so along a spectrum. So for instance, we generally think of the Impossible Burger as fitting neatly into the plant-based category. But if you've tried the Impossible Burger before, or if you've tried cooking it, it has this quality where it appears to bleed, right? And that's because they use an ingredient called soy-like hemoglobin, and that's what gives it the bloody appearance and meaty taste. And like hemoglobin is produced with fermentation. So really the Impossible Burger is already on this spectrum of different production platforms. However, when we think about the different careers and the different backgrounds that are relevant for different jobs in this space, it can be useful to differentiate across plant-based, cultivated, and fermentation-derived proteins. So for those of you pursuing careers in science or engineering, this is one way to think about the different areas you can explore. So whether you're looking at plant-based, cultivated, fermentation-derived, or even conventional meat, production typically involves these stages. So first, sourcing. To source is to choose your inputs. That could be a plant, a microbe, or a sample of animal cells, for example. And then you optimize through either breeding or engineering or changing the cell culture conditions if we're talking about cultivated meat. And then you grow your cells, either plant cells or animal cells. And then this last step is where art and science come together to process end products that have the desired taste, texture, smell, and appearance. And we need technological innovation at every stage in this process for all of the different production platforms in order to truly accelerate the field at large. But when we zoom out and view the entire alternative protein ecosystem, do that. Okay. We see a greater diversity of roles that are no longer limited to just science and engineering. So the previous slide focused on research and development for inputs, production, and end products. But we need investment to fund all of this research. And once we have the end products, we need to establish distribution channels that make these products actually accessible. And across each of these stages, we're depending on industry enablers, such as the labor force, business services, and compliance, which ensures that we're meeting regulatory requirements and producing food safely. So when people ask us questions like, what should I study in order to pursue a career in alternative proteins? You can start to see why the answer is really that it depends. Each segment of this value chain employs many different roles requiring varying skill sets. And on top of that, this is a new and growing industry. This means that some roles are more in demand now, and we expect others to be more in demand later. So I'll go more into detail on that in this section. We'll explore which backgrounds are relevant for different career fields in the alternative protein space. All right, I'll start by saying that these jobs are, they exist across many sectors. So in academia, this path is probably the most established or familiar pathway, especially if you're a scientist or someone in grad school. But within academia, research on alternative proteins is already underway at many universities around the world. And getting a PhD would allow you to lead your own research group. It would also allow you to become a faculty member and teach the next generation of talent. Increasingly, we're seeing alternative protein courses being offered at universities. And once we start to establish full degree programs, there will be a greater need for instructors. And then there's also a need to train the manufacturing and agricultural labor force. In the United States, we typically do this through extension programs that come out of four-year universities, as well as career technical education programs through two-year institutions. And this might vary depending on which country you're in. But at least in the US, to instruct these types of training programs, a PhD isn't necessarily required. It usually depends more on industry experience. So that brings me to the next sector of industry. And the industry is composed of business to consumer companies, or B2C, as well as business to business companies, or B2B. B2C companies are probably ones you might recognize from the grocery store. So again, like Impossible, Beyond Meat. But B2B companies might be less familiar to consumers. And examples of these can include ingredient companies or even manufacturing companies that design processing equipment. There, within industry, there's the option to create a startup or to work at a startup. And then there are also companies that are relatively new, but past the startup phase. And then on the other hand, on the other end of the spectrum, there are more established companies that are starting to get into the alternative protein space. So this includes food companies, even some conventional meat companies, as well as companies in biotech, biopharma, and other life sciences. I'll note that many of the open positions in industry right now are for PhD level scientists, but compared to academia, the industry offers roles for a greater variety of backgrounds and education. So for instance, these companies need to fund their research and operations. So we need people who can fill these finance and investor roles. Other roles include project management, operations, and so on. The third sector is government, which can again include research in, but this time in government labs. Alternatively, you can direct public funding into alternative protein research. And you can do this by working as a program leader for a government research funding agency, such as the NSF. Or if you're interested in policy, you can encourage policymakers to advocate for public funding, or maybe you could even be a policy member who supports alternative proteins. And then on the regulatory side, there's a lot of work to be done in order to approve cultivated meat for sale in most countries. Again, I mentioned that Singapore is the only one that has already completed this process. Last but not least, there are nonprofits like the Good Food Institute, which offer many ways to support the ecosystem at large. So for example, I mentioned a lot of my work right now is to support faculty members in academia who are building novel alternative protein courses. So other nonprofits in this space include New Harvest, which is focused on cellular agriculture or cultivated meat, and then also the Plant-Based Foods Association. So by working at a nonprofit, you kind of, it's possible you'll get the opportunity to also work adjacent to academia, government, and industry. Coming back to the question of what should I study if I want to pursue an alternative protein career? Again, this depends on your interests because you'll be more motivated in a role that you find interesting, right? But if you've narrowed it down to careers in science or engineering, then these are some of the areas of technical expertise that are needed by the industry. It's not a complete list, but hopefully this gives you an idea of how the three production platforms differ and how they overlap. It might also help inform what electives you choose if you're still a student. So for instance, if I saw this back when I was studying chemical engineering, and if I wanted to go into cultivated meat, then I would probably make sure to seek out electives related to tissue engineering. So presently, there's very high demand for the right combination of scientific expertise and entrepreneurial spirit. But in order to build a robust alternative protein ecosystem, we need additional expertise. So these are just some of the non-technical roles that are just as essential for the ecosystem at large. To give a few examples, as a nutritionist, you could help advise food scientists and engineers to make these alternative protein products healthier than conventional meat, which would help more consumers make the transition. And also as a scientific journalist, you could craft compelling narratives about alternative proteins, which can have a big influence on public perception and consumer acceptance. So why is it an exciting time to consider a career in this space? I firstly want to acknowledge that it can be difficult to forge your path in any emerging field, but nevertheless, we really do feel like it's a great, exciting time to consider this field for many reasons. First of all, we are currently in this sweet spot where you can find support and collaborators, but the ecosystem still has plenty of white space opportunities. There's also the potential for tremendous positive impact across many critical cause areas, such as public health, climate change, environmental justice, and global food security. So by working to accelerate the alternative protein field, you get to have a positive impact on each of these areas, which is really exciting. And as an emerging industry, there's also a greater chance of you becoming a leader in your field. And along the way, you can learn new things and be on the cutting edge of technology. And especially if you're someone who thrives at the intersection of disciplines, then this is a really great area to be in. To give an example, back in 2021, the European Space Agency actually hired a cultivated meat scientist to explore ways to produce food during long-term missions. So another question we get asked a lot is, what's it like to work at GFI? I won't be focusing on that in this presentation, but if you want to learn more, we have general hiring sessions every other Wednesday. And similar to this more general careers call, you can pose questions for this one ahead of time through the document that's linked on this slide. All right. Here is the last section of this presentation, and here I'll discuss how to build your career in the alternative protein field, and I'll offer various tips and resources. And to reiterate, I'll be sharing these slides with you all. I'll drop the link in the chat right after, so you have access to all the links that are going to be in this section, so don't worry about copying anything down. All right, so when I describe alternative proteins as an emerging field or an emerging industry, I mean two things. One, it's at the intersection of several disciplines, and two, it's a relatively new space. So preparing yourself for a career in a more traditional field, like software engineering, for example, that can be a lot more straightforward because there are clear educational pathways through computer science programs and boot camps. There are professional societies and mentorship programs. There's an endless number of textbooks and even, books on preparing for the interview. On the other hand, emerging fields are not like that yet. The industry is still evolving, and the educational pathways into the field are literally being constructed as we speak. So as a result, it can feel very overwhelming to figure out what steps you need to take to set yourself up to enter this space. But fortunately, we can learn a lot from experts in other emerging fields. This list of rules that I'll go through actually came from folks in the emerging ecological forecasting space. So I'd like to walk through some of these steps and see how we can apply the same ideas to our field of alternative proteins. So the first recommendation is to set goals. This means asking yourself, why do you want to work in the alternative protein space? Like, are there particular research questions that excite you, or is there a certain company or organization that you want to work for? And from there, what are the skills that you need to either investigate these research questions or land your dream job? As a personal example, when I realized that I wanted to move from the industry into the nonprofit sector, I volunteered for a local nonprofit focused on food security. So the next recommendation is to leverage existing resources both within and outside the emerging discipline. So the lack of training resources is a huge issue for any emerging field. So at GFI, we're trying to create these resources and make them open access. In the next few slides, I'll showcase some of these resources that are specific to alternative proteins. So first of all, we maintain a career portal, which is an up-to-date listing of available positions in the alternative protein ecosystem. This is definitely a good place to start, especially if you're graduating or maybe you're already working and looking for a full-time job now. On the webpage for the career portal, you'll also find a talent database, that you can add yourself to. And this is the list that we share with startups who are looking to expand their teams. And then we also have this interview series that profiles a variety of pioneering researchers in our field. And in this series, we ask them how they entered this space, how their background came into play, what challenges they foresee. And they also offer a good amount of advice for folks looking to join the future food movement. They talk a lot about specifically how they leverage skill sets from other fields and disciplines. And there's a mix of representation from founders who spent decades in other industries, as well as researchers who jumped straight into the field after their undergraduate training. So highly recommend checking out this series. And then for those of you more interested in entrepreneurship, we have a startup manual which lays out the key steps for starting an alternative protein company. There's a lot in here to learn from experts and entrepreneurs. So even if you're thinking about working at a startup, but not necessarily creating one, this guide could still be a really useful resource. And then when it comes to navigating the field, we have this guide that you can check out. It's called our student resource guide, but it's actually geared towards all newcomers to the alternative protein space. And this will give you a walkthrough of the various tools, communities, and databases that you can take advantage of as you explore the alternative protein space. And to get you up to speed on the industry, you can learn from our state of the industry reports, which cover the commercial landscape, investments, regulatory developments, and the latest scientific progress for all of the production platforms. And then in terms of learning about alternative proteins, these are some resources I recommend for educating yourself. We have a free open access course on plant-based, cultivated, and fermentation-derived proteins. After completing this course, we know that at least one person went on to create an alternative protein startup, and several others have reported that they mentioned this course on their resume and that it helped them land a job in the industry. We also have a course database that tracks various course offerings at universities and other institutions around the globe. Some of these courses are limited to university students, but many of these programs are remote and open to anyone to enroll. So for any of you that have questions about either graduate programs, or just if you want to see which universities offer alternative protein courses, then I would recommend checking out this course database. One more note on rule number 2. You also want to check out resources outside the emerging discipline. And this is just as important. So for example, if you're trying to enter the alternative protein field from a law or chemistry background, then you should still join those professional societies focused on law or chemistry, or whatever field you're coming from, and continue to explore the resources that they have to offer. So this brings me to rule number 3, which is when resources do not exist, help create them. GFI is a huge supporter of open access and open sharing. So if you want to create a resource for the field, we would be happy to help amplify it. And as an added bonus, you would now have a concrete example of a contribution that you made to the field that you can refer to as you network and apply for jobs. So I'll share some examples from our community of alternative protein movement builders. So creating educational resources is something that many of you can do. Students from Johns Hopkins hosted a meat mimicry workshop where they designed and led a like hemoglobin extraction experiment. And again, this is that ingredient in the Impossible Burger that makes it bleed. So they made their slides and their lab protocol publicly available through our curriculum repository. So educators can run this experiment in their own classrooms. Another cool example is that students from the Cambridge University Alt Protein Society are currently hosting this 8-week fundamentals program that about 400 people from all over the world are currently participating in. And they designed this curriculum with the help of our curriculum repository. So it was just really cool to see that they were able to pass these teachings along to hundreds of people around the world. These are both examples of educational resources, but you could also build technical resources like short form tutorials or even career building resources. Let's see. Okay, I see a thing in the chat asking if someone can send the links. Let me actually just send a link to this presentation so y'all can follow along. All right, let me know if that works. All right, going back to this, I lost my space. Okay. This last part I wanted to share here was that the Wageningen Alt Protein Project group created a thesis guide for students at their university to help them identify different problems that they could solve. So for example, if they're doing a capstone project at the end of their degree program, this guide can help students find relevant faculty to reach out to and just understand what the open questions are in each of the production platforms for alternative proteins. So this was just another really neat example of community created resources. All right, so rule number 4 is to attend workshops and conferences. This will allow you to, of course, network, meet people that are hiring, get more exposure to the different companies that are out there. So to get started, you can visit gfi.org/events for webinars and more. We have a Business of Alt Protein seminar series for those of you looking to go into entrepreneurship or more commercial roles. And this series covers topics related to starting and scaling a good food business. So next Tuesday, co-founders from Moonshot Collaborative will be sharing their latest findings from consumer research projects on alternative proteins. And then each month we also have a Science of Alternative Protein seminar, which is geared toward a more technical audience and focuses on cutting edge research developments. And then we also have a swim series, which stands for Seafood, Webinar, and Informal Mixer. And this focuses on alternative seafoods. So next Friday is the next swim event, and you'll get to learn from 3 experts in cell culture. And then in addition to checking our events page, there are an endless number of mailing lists that you can join, both some from GFI and plenty of mailing lists from lots of other organizations. And these are really great about promoting conferences and seminars. So I would look for a mailing list that's specific to whatever region you're located in so that you could find some in-person events as well. Rule number 5 is to join or help create a network specific to the emerging field. So a few suggestions we offer are for students, definitely recommend checking out the Alt Protein Project. This is a global student movement that's dedicated to turning universities into engines for alternative protein education, research, and innovation. We currently have 16 chapters in the US and throughout Europe and Israel. And you can learn more by visiting this link. Just so you know, we're opening up applications this month and hoping to double the number of chapters that we have all around the world. So if you're interested in starting one of these communities at your institution, then stay tuned and we'll be announcing more details on this month. And then for students and everyone else, this includes entrepreneurs, scientists, subject matter experts, you can join our GF Ideas community, which is a really great place to network and connect with other people doing work that you might be interested in. All right, rule number 6 is to find collaborators to work with and learn from. The communities that I mentioned on the most recent slide are excellent for finding collaborators, but here is one additional resource. This is our collaborative researcher directory, which we made to make it easier for researchers to find other collaborators with complementary skills. So in this directory, researchers indicate the kinds of collaborations they're open to, whether it be with students, labs, or companies. And many of these labs are hiring, and some folks in the directory list whether they're open to serving as mentors. So if I recommend checking this out, and if there's someone you find in this directory that sounds interesting, you can go ahead and reach out to them through their LinkedIn or ResearchGate profile that they've provided. All right, the next 2 rules are to learn the history and have a vision for the future. So here's a resource to help you get started with this. We have an initiative called Advancing Solutions for Alternative Proteins, or ASAP. And for this, we conducted extensive research and interviews with over 150 experts across the field in order to identify the highest priority areas and possible solutions. So taking some time to explore this database can help you contextualize the alternative protein field and help you narrow down the contributions that you want to make in shaping the future of this movement. The last rules are to measure your success, so periodically reevaluate your goals and adjust your plan as needed. And number 10, advocate for yourself. I'll leave it up to you all to check out this guide for more details. The link is here in the bottom left corner. I just want to wrap this up. So I'll end with a few more helpful resources from other organizations. If you haven't heard of 80,000 Hours, they are a London-based nonprofit that investigates which careers have the largest positive social impact, and they provide career advice based on those findings. And this is how I actually found my current role at GFI. So if you go to their job portal and filter by factory farming, this will include job postings in the alternative protein space. And then there's also Animal Advocacy Careers, which is an organization that offers many detailed skills profiles for animal advocacy roles, including this profile on technical research for animal product alternatives, aka alternative proteins. Something cool to note is that both of these organizations offer one-on-one calls for career advice, so you can apply for that. And then you can also check out this career guide here for ending factory farming, which was created by members of our alt protein community, bringing it back to rule number 3, create resources where needed. So yeah, I believe that is it for the slides portion of this webinar. Thank you again for listening.